Mulk, which means property, possession, money, substance. Mulk. In Hebrew it means kingship. Mulk, Malik in Hebrew and Arabic is king. Malik in Hebrew, Malik in Arabic. David, King David would be called Melech David. When you hear Jews sing about King David, they say, David, Melech Israel, King of Israel, Melech Israel. Malik in Arabic. In any event, Mulk is another noun from that same cluster of consonants. And Mamluk means possessed by the government, possessed by the king, possessed by the authority. Mamluk is basically a slave or someone who's owned by the state. What they did was they imported conquered captives that the Turkish armies were capturing first in Turkey and northern Turkey, later in the Balkans. Later in the Balkans, as the Turks expanded their power up the Balkans towards Vienna, through Yugoslavia and these places. Albania, you know, is still Muslim. How did Albania get to be Muslim? Because the Turks pushed on up in the 1500s. Bosnia is Muslim area of Yugoslavia with the pushing of the Turks up through the Balkans towards Vienna. They were stopped in Vienna around the 1600s. But in any event, all that aside, they would take levies and sell them to the Egyptian authorities. And these young boys, who were basically captives and slaves, white slaves now, were brought up in Egypt as rulers, owned by the state, slaves of the state. It was sort of like a Platonic republic. Someone had read Plato's Republic and had kind of said, this is the way to get a good ruling military class, get people who have no family loyalties. You know, how many read Plato's Republic here? Well, in Plato's Republic you have a philosopher-king class, and then you have an auxiliary class, right? Let's get some people who don't have any family ties, let's train them so they're not corruptible through family ties. It turns out they did get corrupted, but supposedly they were not to have families. The new successors were to be new levies of purchases of the Christian, mostly Christian children from the Balkans and other places. And they would be Islamicized, and they would become a property of the state, and they would fight for the state. And that worked. And the people who stopped the Mongols in Palestine was a Mamluk army. And this was already functioning, you see. For some reason, by 1250s, it was already functioning. I don't know how it got functioning so fast after. Maybe Salah didn't install it, I don't know. But in 1259, at the Battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine, the Mongol expansion westwards was stopped in the Middle East. The Mamluk armies defeated the Mongols in Palestine at Ain Jalut in 1258 or 1259, I don't know the precise date there. But you see, that explains a lot of the situation in the modern Middle East, because it was scorched earth everywhere the Mongols had been previously. So Syria and Iraq were scorched earth. But Egypt survived untouched, and Palestine to a large extent. So the center of the Arab world, which had previously been in Baghdad, swung over to Cairo, though it wasn't Shiite anymore. Now it was Mamluk control. And the Mamluks flourished for about 300 years, into the 1500s. And they were a very successful dynasty, and they replenished themselves with new levies of slaves who were converted to Islam and then became governors and soldiers. And this situation actually moved into the Turkish world too. And the Turks had a whole group of slaves who were then part of the army, and they were Christians usually, but had been converted to Islam as boys, and they were called Janissaries. And the Turkish, if you know military history, the Turkish Janissary Corps was formidable and frightening. It was the backbone, like the French Foreign Legion of the Turkish army. The Janissaries, who were these, sort of like the Mamluks in Egypt, sort of like slaves or descendants of converted slaves or whatever. In any event, as the Turks got more and more successful, now the Ottoman Turks in Asia Minor, they did storm Constantinople, its famous date, 1453. And then they spread around the whole Mediterranean again, and they took Egypt in the early 1500s, around 1517. And they kept the Mamluks there as a kind of sub-control group, whereas they owed allegiance to the Ottoman Caliph, who now moved to Byzantium. And you probably saw the Mosque of Hagia Sophia, which used to be the Cathedral of Santa Sophia. Beautiful, beautiful place. Now got minarets and everything around it. It is a handsome building, isn't it? It was the central church in Byzantium, but the Turks took it over and made it into a mosque. They put the center of Turkish Ottoman government in Constantinople. They changed the name of the city to Istanbul. Well, Constantinople, Istanbul is the same. Just a kind of bastardization again. Constantinople, Constantinople, Istanbul. That's how you get that word. It's just compression and a mispronunciation turning into an actual name. Yankee, I think, and hunky. I'll bet hunky comes from Yankee. And so to some extent it's from the English, I think. They couldn't pronounce Anglais, as the French said English. Anglais, 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 Yankees, 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 Hunkies, Hunkies. So that's where I think most people think the etymology of the word Yankee is from. Yankee imperialism, an English attempt to pronounce the French word for English. Now becomes standard vocabulary. We're in America are all Yanks. That's how language operates. Very interesting subject. Anyway, the Mamluks limped on in Egypt for another 300 years after that till the 1800s. 1800 exactly, when Napoleon appeared with a French Revolutionary Army and told the Egyptians, because he realized that the Ottoman Empire was weak, that he had come as a Muslim, because he was from Corsica and understood Muslim culture, and that he was a Muslim, and he had come to free all Muslims, and that he was going to overthrow the Mamluk dynasty, which he did, and had a battle under the pyramids, the famous battle of the French troops. Unfortunately, at that time, the English fleet was fighting him, the same fleet that ultimately defeated him at the Battle of Trafalgar 7 years later, under Nelson. In 807 was the Battle of Trafalgar. Well, they also beat him at the Battle of the Nile. They sunk all his ships around 1800 when they were anchored at in the harbor off of the Nile and Alexandria. The British came in and destroyed all his ships and stranded Napoleon there, and he ultimately had to flee and lost his whole army there, went back to France and proclaimed himself emperor. But the fact of the matter, he was totally annihilated by the British in Egypt. But he did bring modernization to Egypt in destroying the Mamluk dynasty and creating a new country there and detaching it from the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire continued in control of everything. As I told you, Turks were Sunnis. They had the whole Middle East. They had most of North Africa. Egypt was Mamluk. They had control of the Holy Side.